Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I think we're in for a treat tonight. I'm Sue Vita, the Chief of the Music Division, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's presentation, Happy Little Seahorses, Brahms' unwritten Melusina opera. The next installment in a lecture series at the Music Division is really delighted to be co-sponsors with the American Musicological Society. We began this series over 15 years ago with the intention of highlighting meaningful scholarship that the American Musicological Society members have produced in researching the library's unique musical collections. And over the past decade, we've been fortunate to learn about a variety of topics from Schoenberg to Showboat. And today we turn to Johannes Brahms and an opera that never was. As always, we are recording today's lecture, so it will be available to watch online. And this is really a very, very important part of this lecture because we know that people use it and not only research it and go back to it, but it's used in classes. So this is something that is important. Past lectures are already available online, and for those of you here today, I'd like to point out that we have a great display of materials relevant to the lecture, and I hope if you haven't seen it on the way in that you will take a minute to look at it after the talk. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Allen Sommerfeld, Senior Music Reference Specialist and AMS Council Member, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Laurie McManus, Associate Professor in Music History and Literature at Shenandoah University. Dr. McManus holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has presented at national and international conferences and is published in 19th Century Music, the Journal of Music History Pedagogy, Jazz Perspectives, Studi Musicali, Quarterly Review of Film and Video, and the American Brahms Society newsletter. Her first book, Brahms in the Priesthood of Art, Gender and Art Religion in the 19th Century German Musical Imagination, was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Her forthcoming second book, Trauma, Sound, and Music in the Contemporary Horror Film, is under contract with Routledge. Dr. McManus is the recipient of the American Musicological Society's Bozarth Award and currently serves as the Vice President of the American Brahms Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McManus.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Paul for inviting me to apply for this. Thank you, Library of Congress, for accepting me to give this talk. Let's test the PowerPoint. Great, we'll start there. So, this evening's talk will be exploring the peculiar subject of Brahms and opera. Peculiar in that he seems to have had an interest in composing opera, but never managed to do so. And usually we musicologists prefer to analyze what composers wrote rather than what they did not write. But the absence or lack of an opera in itself is interesting. And I would certainly not be the first to psychoanalyze why Brahms did not write one, not unlike how there has been plenty of speculation as to why Brahms did not marry Clara Schumann, right? So composer-centric interpretations abound when you have a figure as canonical and well-loved as Brahms. But in this talk, I will not be looking at Brahms's motivations as much as those of friends in his circle. Because we do not have any opera music by Brahms, but we do have more than one drafted libretto written for Brahms. In particular, the Library of Congress houses one such drafted libretto that has never been transcribed or published or translated. So the libretto is not a standalone document, but it rather is contained in a letter sent to Brahms by one of those friends, namely the conductor Hermann Levy. There he is, sitting. I believe he was the main catalyst in Brahms' search for an opera subject during the decade of their friendship, so he'll be one of our main characters tonight, along with the friend Anna Ettlinger, who actually wrote the libretto. These two Jewish creators, a conductor and an author, are often overlooked as agents within the musicological record, as we tend to privilege composers. However, a close investigation of the libretto reveals how they attempted to craft an operatic path for Brahms that fit with contemporary trends and long-standing cultural contexts, while simultaneously setting him apart from his arch-rival Richard Wagner. In the years roughly between 1864 and 76, Brahms was close friends with Hermann Levy, who was a conductor in southern Germany, where he helped establish the young composer's reputation and encouraged him to write an opera. The Brahms scholar Karl Geiringer would later call this relationship one of the most significant in Brahms's artistic life. Unfortunately, Levy's musical sensibilities changed over this period as he transformed from a fervent supporter of Brahms to a Wagner fanatic. And this shift would contribute to a total break in the friendship with Brahms by 1877. And also, unfortunately, for many decades after his death, Levy was best remembered for being the Jewish conductor who premiered Wagner's Parsifal. So we might do well to begin with a brief outline of this Brahms-Levy relationship. Levy met Brahms in 1862 after a concert, but they did not become better acquainted until summer of 1864, when Clara Schumann introduced them in Baden-Baden, where she had moved the previous year. Here's your convenient map of locations we'll be talking about tonight. Here's where he was in Karlsruhe, Baden-Baden's there. Munich is where he moved, and Brahms settled in Vienna. That August, Brahms visited Karlsruhe to attend a music festival, and he stayed with Levy, who had just moved there the year before to take the position of chief conductor at the Court Theater. Brahms's reaction to Levy, who was 6 years younger and only 24 at the time, is preserved in a letter to the violinist friend Joseph Joachim. That young man, in spite of all the theater conductor routine, is so fresh and gazes so brightly onto the loveliest heights that it's truly a pleasure. From that fall to around summer of 1866, they seem to have been close. Brahms spent months at a time near Baden-Baden and in Karlsruhe, writing the song Die Mainacht, published as Opus 43, number 2, for those of you keeping score at home, and most of his German Requiem in spring 1866, while staying with their mutual friend, the photographer and engraver Julius Allgaier, and he's in that photo too. Later, 1866 saw somewhat of a cooling, and they seem to have drifted apart in the next couple years, although there's simply not much in the letter record. By 1870, they seem to have reconciled, and Levy spent the half of the decade continuing his Sisyphean quest to persuade Brahms to write an opera. As I mentioned, I believe Levy was the main catalyst in Brahms' search for an opera, and the majority of Brahms' correspondence concerning opera is between the two of them. As Brahms' first major biographer, Max Kalbeck, noted retrospectively, Levy leapt from Brahms, who gave him nothing to do, to Wagner, his principal area being the musical dramatic. So Kalbeck here must be referring to opera, as Brahms produced large-scale orchestral and choral orchestral pieces in the decade he was friends with Levy. Perhaps Levy felt a sense of ownership over opera. Among all of Brahms' close friends, he was the most directly involved in opera, from conducting older and newer works to translating Mozart's Italian libretti to rescoring recitatives, from harpsichord to string quartet. He encouraged local friends and acquaintances to draft opera librettos or scenarios, with his own input, of course. These authors included Anna Ettlinger, who we'll meet her shortly, a local pastor, Emil Zittel, the Russian author Ivan Turgenev, mutual friend and author Julius Allgaier, and the Nobel-winning prize poet Paul Heise. Despite the involvement of these others, Brahms' correspondence with Levy suggests that he understood the conductor as the ultimate originator of any proposed operatic material. in response to the biblical subject of Sulamith, that was Emil Zittel's now lost draft. He wrote to Levi, "Now I know your opinion of me and opera texts for me." Of more interest is his letter of fall 1872, in which he asks Levi to discuss opera plans with Heise on his behalf. "Can you not share further details with me, if possible concerning our opera, as lovey-dovey as can be, and whatever else?" That's on this slide. So the phrase zärtlich verliebt carries a connotation of infatuation and almost exaggerated tenderness. So here it suggests a tongue-in-cheek tone while also implying a shared intimacy regarding the opera project. In fall of 1872, Levi relocated to Munich to take up the post of Royal Bavarian Court Conductor, while Brahms settled in Vienna to direct the concert series of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, that is the Society of Music Friends. You can still see concerts there today if you go to Vienna. Despite Levi's efforts to help Brahms establish a foothold in Munich, which is where he became friends with the poet Heise, in the mid-1870s came a break. The consensus is that Levi's growing obsession with Wagner caused this rift. Looking back on the split at the end of his life, Levi reflected, "We just became aware one fine day that we didn't understand each other anymore, that we had nothing to say to one another." And they never managed to reconcile, even though Levi hoped they would. As late as 1886, he complained he couldn't understand why, given that Wagner was 3 years dead, and that all personal matters have receded into the background, that Brahms would still not make an appearance in Bayreuth. It's possible Levi overlooked the obvious explanation, but Brahms would want to avoid him. Speaking of Wagner, before we get into more specifics of Brahms's operatic search, I should fill in a little context on that composer's doing, since he was the looming dominant figure in German opera in this period. Born a generation before Brahms, Richard Wagner had established himself as a theater conductor and composer in Dresden by his 30s, and after the failed revolutions of 1848 and 49, he had to flee to Switzerland, where he spent time writing voluminous treatises theorizing what German opera should be and having an affair with his patron's wife, Mathilde Wesendonck. Inspired by revolutionary philosophy of the 1840s, he conceived of German opera, in contradistinction to French and Italian opera, as a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, whose music, drama, and gesture should appeal to the purely human. Note, this is a little different from our current popular understanding of Gesamtkunstwerk, which over time has been reduced to just blending all the arts together. Yeah? So Wagner was really trying to apply 1840s philosophy here, such that purely human had a specific holistic meaning, and so he maps drama and text onto the human sense of reason, music onto the human capacity for emotion, and gesture and dance onto the physicality. As Wagner made clear, his theory was derived in part from Ludwig Feuerbach's philosophy, itself a reaction against the abstraction of German idealism in the first part of the century. Feuerbach and other 1840s revolutionaries felt that idealism was politically ineffective and that Germans needed to reorient themselves to a philosophy that's grounded in the real, sensual, physical world. Is this complicated? Now imagine being a composer 20 years younger than Wagner, just coming of age, and suddenly opera has become this complicated, philosophically, politically motivated apparatus, right? Wagner did not stop at quoting some philosophers, though. It was also convenient for him, as Nicholas Vachani has shown in his study of Wagner's self-branding, to make broad historical claims that the logical direction of musical progress was this new Gesamtkunstwerk. After all, Beethoven had clearly demonstrated that instrumental music was a dead end when he introduced a chorus into the Ninth Symphony, right? So one needed the primal sensual organ of the human voice to make music truly communicative, and unless the artwork is truly communicative, it can have no political affect. And for all the revolutionary rhetoric, Wagner did entirely revise the way he was writing opera in the 1850s. He threw out choruses, dance sequences, arias with repetitive lyrics. He tried to privilege the German dramatic word over the music. And perhaps most famously, of course, he expanded the concept of the leitmotif into this musical backbone of the opera. The clearest example of this revised style is Das Rheingold from 1854. And there really are just long scenes of characters standing around, talking to each other in faux medieval, consonant-laden, alliterative verse. And don't judge Wagner by the orchestral excerpts, but you can certainly judge me as I try to read this tongue twister aloud. Sanft Schloss, schlaf dein Aug, wir beide bauten schlummers bar die Burg. Mächt'ger müde nie, stauten starker Stein wir auf. Steiler Turm, Tür und Tor, deckt und schließt im schlanken Schloss den Saal. I'm done. End of lecture. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so by the late 1850s already, he had stepped back from the heavy emphasis on dramatic dialogue and given more primacy to music in Tristan und Isolde, which was inspired by his newfound interest in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, as well as the aforementioned affair with Mathilde Wesendonck. Tristan did not find a premiere until 1865, when Wagner had finally returned to the German lands under the patronage of Ludwig II. So while Brahms was splitting time in the 1860s between Vienna and southwestern Germany, Wagner was reestablishing himself in Munich before he received the funding to have his own theater built in the small Bavarian town of Bayreuth. So Bayreuth and Munich are where Levy would spend the last 2 decades of his career. But we're focusing on the period of his friendship with Brahms, so back to the 1860s and early 70s we go. So for Brahms, the 1860s represent his first maturity as a composer, as the music theorist James Webster has written, and that is represented with an early mastery of form, a period of Schubertian influence with more substantial song collections, his first forays into large-scale public choral music, most famously the German Requiem, but also there's a dramatic cantata based on Goethe's Rinaldo, and I mentioned this song cycle. I'll come back to it. So critics, even in Brahms's own lifetime, noted that such compositions represented an emergence from his study period, and they mark his first public successes. For his part, Levy helped to establish Brahms's reputation in Karlsruhe and the surrounding area while actively encouraging him to find a suitable topic for an opera. As Levy reported to a friend in 1869, Brahms is suffering the misery of all composers, searching for an opera libretto and finding nothing. By that point, Wagner had been producing opera for 25 years and was a major cultural icon, and Brahms was just coming into his own true success as the composer of the German Requiem. Necessarily, then, any operatic work by Brahms would have been received in relation to Wagner's already established legacy. As Levy wrote to Clara Schumann, it would be so necessary one would stand up and fight against certain people with notes. And in that quote, he's referring to a psychological study against Wagner that decried the composer as sick. So he says someone should actually write an opera to fight against Wagner. So as a voracious consumer of music old and new, Brahms was, in theory, well-positioned to step into the world of opera, and he expressed an interest in doing so. He attended many operatic performances. He conducted an early performance of Pauline Viodor Garcia's The Last Sorcerer in Baden-Baden. He possessed the manuscript of the Venusberg music from Tannhäuser. And of course, as an early music scholar, he was familiar with past greats. Practically, while not familiar with the theater world itself, he had Levy accumulating experience since 1862, first conducting the opera in Rotterdam, and then from 1864 working with stage director Edouard Devrient in Karlsruhe. Levy's experience with opera in this period has been well documented by his biographer Friedrich Haas. He conducted many of the canonic operas we know today, as well as then popular, if now unknown, works. such as François-Adrien Beaulieu's La Dame Blanche and Konradin Kreuzer's Das Nachtlager in Granada. You can see some of these on PowerPoint. Throughout this period of the late 1860s and early 70s, Levy worked tirelessly to find a suitable libretto for Brahms, proposing various topics from biblical stories to chivalric romances. One of the more entertaining possibilities includes a potential collaboration with the Russian author Ivan Turgenev of Fathers and Sons fame, who was living in Baden-Baden at that time as a friend of the aforementioned Pauline Vieiro Garcia. The plot of this scenario involves two old friends who, in the heat of an argument, undertake an American duel in which a coin is tossed and the loser has to go off and shoot himself. What? Yes. So the surviving friend lives with this guilt for years and later discovers that the other friend had never followed through with the duel anyway. And so all are reconciled at the end. Brahms found this scenario entirely absurd. An apologetic Turgenev scholar has offered that perhaps it was intended as a parody. There's no evidence of such intent, and the melodramatic absurdity of many 19th century librettos taken on their own makes it impossible to tell. However, Brahms's response suggested that he did not understand it as a parody. So that topic was swiftly rejected. And that brings us to the subject of tonight's talk. So the present untitled draft libretto was written in 1871, and it takes as its subject the centuries-old legend of the mermaid Melusina. And then the name could be familiar to some classical music fans. Felix Mendelssohn wrote an overture on the subject that remains in the standard repertoire. More on that later. So Levy was still employed in Karlsruhe until the end of the 1871-72 season, and he collaborated with mutual friend and author Anna Ettlinger. So the Ettlingers were a well-established upper-middle-class Jewish family in Karlsruhe, and Brahms and Levy visited them often to socialize. And we have many entertaining anecdotes and archival materials preserved from their interactions. Here, for example, is a drawing the Ettlinger sisters made as part of an illustrated poetry book for Hermann Levy. And here is a drawing poking fun at Brahms the Bachelor. It reads, "Oh, if only you good maidens knew how his tender heart does bleed for you." So Anna was the sixth of 12 children, and they all entertained varying degrees of artistic and musical interests, which is what you would expect from a middle-class German Jewish family, given the German cultural emphasis on lifelong learning and self-cultivation. So she was a member of the local Philharmonic choir, even though her aspirations were more literary. Anna, in particular, took advantage of the limited educational opportunities available to young women at the time. She spent a few months in Berlin taking courses at the Victoria Lyceum for young women, which had just been founded in 1869. So Levy encouraged her to write this libretto after her study there, challenging her basically to put her education to use. And she would go on to become a respected author, educator, and women's rights activist. While Levy credits Ettlinger with writing most of it, both the libretto and the letter that contains it are in his hand, which you can see on display there. Now, the musicologist who compiled the Brahms-Levy correspondence, Leopold Schmidt, did not transcribe the libretto in the published volume. So I've produced my own translation and transcription. Now, Ettlinger would probably have approved of the omission. She later recollected, "To my horror, Kalbeck and others named me as the author of an opera text for Brahms. Never would I have believed that this long-forgotten, entirely dilettantish youthful effort, which Levy persuaded me to do, would be mentioned publicly." Right. So rather than evaluate the artistic quality of the draft, let's analyze it for its various influences to understand how she and Levy attempted to negotiate an operatic path for Brahms that was distinct from the looming figure of Richard Wagner, albeit still somewhat influenced by him. The libretto is written over 3 leaves, folded to create 12 pages. Apparently, Levy ran out of ink about 3/4 of the way through. The text just continues in pencil at the start of Act 4, as you can see. And the scans that I initially looked at the Library of Congress, where much of the Brahms-Levy correspondence is currently held, were out of order at the time of my seeing the source. So after Levy's signature, the libretto continues in 4 more pages of ink. I consulted with musicologist librarian Paul Sommerfeld to determine the correct foliation. It seems that 1 sheet of the letter was placed inside the other 2, most likely for ease of transport. Thank you, Paul. From my study of the libretto, I believe the scenes that were scanned last actually belong in Act 3. So some context here. It's ironic to me that Leopold Schmidt, the musicologist who compiled the Brahms-Levy correspondence but omitted this, actually wrote his dissertation on the history of Märchenopera, fairy tale operas, which comprise their own separate subgenre of opera. As he documented in that 1895 dissertation, the tale of Melusina had first appeared in France in the late 14th century with Jean d'Arras's version, but would have been known to the German speakers through Ludwig Tieck's version, the very wonderful history of Melusina, published in 1800. As Ulrike Ulbrich has argued, the interest in water fairies and other elemental spirits had been renewed in the late 18th century as debates over nature and education evolved into romantic Naturphilosophie. Accordingly, the tale was also treated by Goethe and Franz Grillparzer, and here you can see these incarnations of the Melusina tale. Tieck's version adheres closely to the French medieval tale, which follows a curse through 3 generations of characters, Melusina being the central figure. The basic archetype of the tale contains a few core elements. So the knight Raymond meets her in the woods and marries her on the condition that he leave her alone on Saturdays, the one day of the week where she transforms back into a mermaid. And then he later betrays her trust, thereby bringing ruin to his family. So as in Tieck's love story of the beautiful Magalone and the Count Peter of Provence, this fairy tale is narrated in prose with various songs and poems interspersed throughout, and it has a significant lament given to Melusina toward the end. As I mentioned, in the 1860s, Brahms had set those standalone poems from Magalone as a song cycle, published as his Opus 33. And that was a big step for the young composer because it towed a line between music for domestic consumption and more outwardly dramatic, almost operatic songs. Levy was well acquainted with those songs. He even possessed the manuscripts for 2 of them until his death in 1900. So it seems reasonable for him to suppose that the chivalric tale of Melusina would also appeal to Brahms. Brahms's interest in medieval chivalric tales was not unusual in this period. I already suggested that Wagner had these attempts to, imitate medieval German prose, and many of his operatic subjects deal with knights, Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, Tristan und Isolde. But the vogue for medieval romances goes beyond these canonical composers. It makes sense that in the period of nationalist foment that the Germans would be revisiting and reimagining archetypal tales of their distant past. Upon receiving the libretto, however, Brahms seems not to have thought of the Tieck version, but rather of the Grillparzer version, asking Levy if he was familiar with it. It's perhaps not surprising that Brahms first thought of Grillparzer, as that author had originally written the libretto for Beethoven in 1823, but it was not set to music until Konradin Kreutzer secured the rights from a publisher in 1832. And that we know that Kreutzer's opera, Das Nachtlager von Granada, was performed in Karlsruhe, but I haven't found information about Melusina. In particular, Brahms had suggested the meeting of Melusina and the Count might be a good scene to investigate. In both Tieck and Grillparzer versions, Melusina is essentially a positive character who suffers betrayal from the knight Raymond. Paul K. Whitaker has argued that Grillparzer's Melusina represents the ideal realm of art, which Raymond cannot reconcile with his earthly being as an artist. In contrast, we'll go back to this slide for a second. The Melusina of the Louis Schindelmeister opera, more recent for them, aligns more with this archetypal figure of the enchantress, like an Armida, who uses her supernatural powers to charm Raymond and complicate his engagement to a pure, noble woman. On a side note, Levy did not think much of Schindelmeister, calling him a pitiful specimen of a Kapellmeistered musician. The Melusina, or Vela, as she's called in the Levy-Ettlinger libretto, is not quite like any of these earlier models. She also resembles Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, a sea person who makes a sacrifice to be with a human, but who is betrayed by him. That is, the tale has similarities to the Undine legend, a point to which I'll return. But the core structural element of the Melusina legend is clear, with her taking 1 day a week to be away from her lover to transform into a mermaid, and him breaking the oath to not see her that day and reaping the consequences. Oddly, Melusina does not fit easily into any of the tale type classifications designed by folklorists Arne and Thompson. And maybe it comes close to Swan Maiden, could be understood as a gender-reversed animal as bridegroom. Accordingly, in his revision and expansion of their system, the German folklorist Hans-Jörg Uther created a new system or category just for Melusina. Thus, given the core quality, Brahms recognized this tale as Melusina, despite the name change. In his reply to Levy, he wondered why the character was named Vela instead of Melusina, by which name the legend would have been most familiar. With all that context aside, let's look at the document. So here's the character list provided at the start of the libretto. Please note this is German 19th century script, and all the letters are the same as in modern cursive that you might have learned. So the basic action of the opera, I've highlighted the main characters. I guess he's a main character, but definitely Vela. The main structure of the action is this. All right, so Act 1 begins at a castle in the sea. The sea people, mermaids, what have you, are frolicking and singing about how great it is to be under the water. And this is where the happy little seahorses of the talk's title come into play. Where is it? Seepferdchen, there we are. In German, it seems that Pferdchen, the diminutive chen ending, is just part of the word naturally. So it is little horse of the sea, is the word for seahorse in German. And this is the chorus that reminds me of the Under the Sea chorus if you've seen the Disney Little Mermaid movie. This is it. So Vela does not take part in this. She remains aloof, and she seems to associate with the sea witch. Great. So that's Act 1. Act 2, we have a forest scene. There's a chorus of knights and vassals. Heinrich encounters Vela there somehow, and like Maeterlinck's Melisande, if you know the Debussy opera, she does not initially tell him her name or her origin. He introduces her to his mother, the Countess, who takes a disliking to her. But they fall in love anyway, Heinrich and Vela, and they sing a duet. Great. Act 3 is the most fully realized. Scene 1's a house in the forest. Beate and Hans prepare for their wedding. Heinrich announces he's going to marry Vela. Hartwig is Heinrich's vassal. He rushes to warn the Countess. Vela sings an aria in which she resolves to marry Heinrich in spite of dangers. The sea creatures warn her against this. In scene 2, Vela visits the sea witch in order to become fully human, like the Little Mermaid, right? But on the condition that once every 7 days, she has to return to the sea and spend an hour with the other mermaids. She is also told that she may not enjoy the eternal hereafter. Meanwhile, wedding chorus. Act 4. Hartwig and the peasants warn the Countess that Vela returns to a tent at the sea once a week. They speculate whether some kind of affair is happening or whether she could be a supernatural being. They convince Heinrich to follow her and investigate. Act 5, Heinrich goes and finds her at the sea. He realizes his mistake and begs her for forgiveness, but it's too late to save him. Together, they sink into the sea. It seems that Ettlinger and Levy wanted Vela to be the main character of the story, having fleshed out the opening scene in which she remains apart and aloof from the chorus of sea people. It suggests a certain romantic depth to the character. And in that other scene I mentioned in Act 3, she worries whether she will be Heinrich's ruin, and ultimately she resolves to risk the consequences against the advice of her community. Here is the pivotal aria in which she makes that decision, and it has a typical psychological trajectory of arias in this era. I'll let you look at that for a minute. And there's more. So yes, after this, she makes a deal with the Sea Witch. And this is presented as a brave task, as you can see just from the description of the Sea Witch's cavern. A snake coils around her feet. This is supposed to be threatening as she does it. So here is where she agrees to the conditions. She has to return to the seashore to become a mermaid once a week and will not enjoy the eternal hereafter. She dares to risk everything in spite of all this. So unlike in Tieck's Melusina, there does not appear to be a long lament planned when she discovers the betrayal. Rather, the dramatic pacing sees her and Heinrich reconciling to each other and their fate rather quickly in the final drafted scene. In contrast, Heinrich does not have a fleshed out aria and appears fairly one-dimensional, almost more as a prop or motivating factor for Vela's decisions. So there are a couple potential influences here that could explain the heightened sense of agency with which they imbued Vela. The first is Anna Ettlinger's stance as a feminist. Now you might say there's not much feminist in what I just described in the plot. Right. Making sacrifices for a man may not strike us as particularly feminist today, but we should recall the historical context of the German women's movement. It was, on the whole, less radical than the women's movement in France. You can think of cross-dressing George Sand, if you will, if you're a Chopin fan. And the main goals for women were to achieve equal work and education. The middle-class ideal of marriage and spiritual motherhood was still upheld. Still in the process of completing her education, Ettlinger was well aware of these concerns, and she had already published an article in the previous year in the regional newspaper here, advocating for the women's rights movement. In this multi-part series, which is presented as a dialogue between A and B, she argues that women's apparent paucity of achievements was actually caused by societal and educational constraints, rather than a natural ability or lack thereof. Girls at that time only received formal education to the mid-teens and in limited subject areas. So this in turn prevented them from attaining a wide range of educational or employment opportunities. Ettlinger advocated for women to have the tools to become independent members of society, and she herself was a model of it, having pursued further educational opportunities to become an author and a teacher. She remained unmarried. In this broader context, we might also understand the importance of active female opera characters as articulated by contemporary women's rights activist and author Louisa Otto-Peters, a generation older than Ettlinger. We could think of her as a kind of Susan B. Anthony of the German women's movement. She even worked with the Wagnerian composer Wendelin Weisheimer as a librettist in 1870, and like that composer, she was a supporter of Wagner. She believed that opera, of all musical genres, had the most potential to be politically effective. So, for there to be strong female characters or role models in that genre was of key importance in the step toward a better, more equitable society. In her interpretation of Wagner's Ring Cycle, she saw Brünnhilde as an especially strong character who exerts agency over the plot. In particular, Brünnhilde's confrontation and persuasion of Wotan in Act 3 of Valkyrie is a scene she mentions. Similarly, in Ettlinger's Melusina draft, Wähler makes a bold decision to venture into a dangerous world, and when Heinrich fails her, she confronts him directly. Wagner's influence, of course, is the other significant element at play here. Indeed, we might detect a shadow of Wagner in this proposed libretto. From its opening chorus of sea maidens set in an underwater castle, to Wähler's willing plunge to death at sea with her beloved, to the chivalric setting, we may find resonances with Wagner's Lohengrin, The Flying Dutchman, Das Rheingold, and Tristan und Isolde. We know Levi was familiar with Tristan and had conducted Die Meistersinger in 1869, which had required him to correspond directly with Wagner. Within a year of drafting this libretto, he would then accept the position of Bavarian court conductor in Munich, where he would become more entangled with Wagner and his music. In terms of text, most of the libretto includes end rhyme verse, as you've seen. Alliterative verse does not appear to have been one of Ettlinger's concerns. After all, Brahms is on record in 1876 telling a friend that he did not like Wagner's stilted, bombastic language. Surely he had revealed this opinion to Levi and friends before then. Brahms's response to the libretto indicates that he was somewhat surprised by it. He wondered why it was 5 acts instead of 3, and he asked Levi to explain why he had chosen this topic. The 5-act model would have been expected in French grand opera, and it seems that Brahms, certainly no fan of the French, would have preferred lighter subject material in a genre closer to something Mozartian. He further questions the gender of the author in his response to Levi, thereby suggesting that he suspected Ettlinger was involved. You can see here, from the question mark over the word dem, which along with the word Dichter in German, that's poet, is gendered masculine. In his reply, Levi admitted he was disarmed and explained that he and Ettlinger had sat down in a few nights and sketched out the scenario, and he described a couple further influences on the libretto that I have not yet discussed. The first of Levi's mentioned influences was visual, namely Moritz von Schwind's Die schöne Melusine, The Beautiful Melusine. This is a series of paintings. I've chosen a few. The Austrian painter Schwind completed this 10-part series in 1869, so it would have been current, although it remains unclear to me in what context Levi and Ettlinger encountered it. Schwind, who had a wide artistic circle of friends, including Franz Schubert, Franz Grillparzer, the aforementioned librettist, and so on, maintained a lifelong interest in fairy tales and had long dealt with various versions of mermaids, water fairies, and other elemental spirits in his work. Of particular interest is that he did not include Melusina's fishtail in this series. As you can see, she's not got one there, and so on. He eliminated the tail in order to make her more of an ideal fairy type, along the lines of Melusina as conceived by Grillparzer, with whom he discussed the project. Given the sparsity of stage directions in the Ettlinger draft, it's also easy to forget Wähler is a mermaid, which inadvertently has the effect of downplaying her otherness, that essential mystery and threat of a figure who is half serpent. It speaks to a slippage between aquatic supernatural archetypes over time, as seen in the further influence of Undine on the libretto. So the second influence cited by Levi was Magdalena Murian's farewell performance as the title character in Albert Lortzing's 1845 opera Undine. This production was put on in Karlsruhe at the Court Theater by Edward de Vriant shortly before his retirement in 1871. It seems to have been a particularly emotionally charged evening, as Murian knew it would be her farewell performance on account of her engagement to Robert Koelle. As she wrote in her memoirs, At the close of the third act, as Undina sinks to return to the water world, it seemed to me as though a rich but work-filled life sank down with me, as though nothing remained behind but a beautiful, dear memory. So given this context, there's clearly the potential for a mermaid-based opera to be emotionally powerful. Yep. So Undina is another legendary European elemental spirit, probably best known to classical music fans today through Maurice Ravel's virtuosic piano suite Gaspard de la Nuit, if anyone heard Sun Jin Cho play it last month at the Kennedy Center. The first movement has shimmering patterns and cascading sweeps meant to evoke the waves hiding the seductive water nymph who lures men to their doom. Lortzing's opera was based on the influential version of Undina told by Friedrich de la Montfouquet, who had published a novel on the subject in 1811, which in turn inspired the most famous version of the tale, at least to us, Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. And Fouquet had collaborated with the German Romantic author and composer E.T.A. Hoffmann on the libretto for his Undina opera in 1816. And the tale also appeared in Lortzing's and Tchaikovsky's operas. Yes, Tchaikovsky wrote an Undina opera in 1869. It is not in the standard repertoire today because he destroyed most of it a few years later. But the love duet was preserved in Swan Lake as one of the Grand Pas de Dieu. Fun fact. So this fairy tale would have been about equally as well known as the similar Melusina legend, and they have much in common. However, a core element of the Undina tale is her lack of a soul, and as I mentioned in the Ettlinger libretto, Vela is told she cannot enjoy eternal life. Another element taken from the Undina story seems to be the death of the lover at Vela's kiss. Although that's not in the Lortzing version, he wrote his own libretto, which involves the knight surviving but just remaining happily in the ocean with Undina. And there is also an essential love triangle in the Undina tale between the knight, her, and another young woman, but that does not occur in the Ettlinger-Levy libretto unless we take a very psychoanalytical approach to the relationship between Heinrich and his mother. In the drafted libretto, Heinrich's mother, the unnamed countess, plays a significant role. She objects to his union with Vela and curses Heinrich in Act 3, and ultimately persuades him to spy on Vela. Her inclusion expands the significant female roles to 3. So we have Vela, Beata, and the countess. She essentially replaces male familial figures in other versions of the Melusina tale. So perhaps with her, we find the element of threatening motherhood shifted away from Vela. That would be Antique's Melusina, because Vela and Heinrich have not been together long enough in this version to have had children. So it seems clear why Brahms was not interested in the libretto. Much of the developed action is devoted to Hans and Beata, lovers who are being married, but who seem to have no unique or noteworthy characteristics. There are also convenient choruses of knights, sea people, wedding celebrants, and a token folk song. While many of these lyrics are written out, strangely, the love duet between Heinrich and Vela in Act 2 is not, nor is Heinrich's aria in Act 4, which reinforces the notion that Vela is the main character. Levy even apologetically noted in a letter that the whole thing seemed a bit childish, and that the side characters needed development, but that could be revised into something better if Brahms was interested in the core fable. The aforementioned folk song, sung by Hans, warns about the dangers of water fairies, and Levy commented in parentheses, "Bad poem, it'll probably be possible to find a real folk song of similar content." You can see it there at the bottom. And this may also be seen as an appeal to Brahms, who maintained a lifelong love of folk song. Brahms called the whole thing a rapturous poetic production and wondered whether he should take it seriously. He may also have objected to the Wagnerian dramatic elements, in particular the ending scene in which the lovers sink to their deaths in the ocean while embracing, which is reminiscent of the Flying Dutchman. And here you see Levy sketched a chord progression to accompany this scene. And the chromatic harmonies suggest further Wagnerian influence. This is my attempt to play it on the piano. On a side note, it's odd to me that the bass line rises as they're sinking into the sea, but I can only suppose this is supposed to represent some sort of catharsis. Brahms would probably have found this musical suggestion uninspiring, as he had already advised Levy to focus on conducting rather than composing in the 1860s. He could be harsh. Brahms, of course, did not go on to write any operas, and this libretto draft was one of many failed proposals that Levy and friends suggested to him in the 1860s and 70s. Although, I will add that Levy's good theatrical sense was confirmed in that the following decade, 3 other operas about Melusino were produced. None of them has made it into the standard repertoire, but suffice it to say there was a vogue for fairy tale operas in German lands at the time. As historical commentators have argued, the looming influence of Wagner made finding an operatic path difficult for Brahms, in addition to the high expectation of Levy and other friends who hoped that Brahms would overtake Wagner in this area. I have written about this at length in my book, providing more of the reception context for both the Wagnerian style of opera and potential alternatives considered by Brahms and others. As for Levy, we could psychoanalyze the conductor and suggest that he responded most profoundly to music with texts, and that his hopes for a grand Brahms opera might represent a kind of consummation of their artistic relationship. He may have subconsciously taken Brahms's rejection of opera as a rejection of him, which may have in turn helped drive him into the Wagnerian camp. And Anna Ettlinger, as far as I'm aware, did not go on to collaborate with any other composers in her literary career. With this drafted libretto, then, we see the tantalizing potential for these 3 creators to stake an artistic claim in the operatic world with a well-positioned and then popular subject. And so, on a closing note, I've included my own cartoon of how well this worked out. Thank you very much for your time.
We have time for questions.
I can't leave this PowerPoint slide up, can I? Let's go back to this.
Hi. I was wondering if you could, I was looking at some of the materials back there, and I was wondering if you could talk about the nature of the relationship between Brahms and Levy, because some of the texts that are translated back there are a little suggestive. There's some stuff about left behind robes and touching fabrics that is a little much.
Okay, let me disclaim that my views do not represent every Brahms scholar's views. Then I will joke that Brahms sometimes seems to have trouble keeping track of his clothing. He was very organized in his music, and not always in other areas of his life. Okay, so Levy, I think, I'm writing an article on this at the moment, may have been a little infatuated with Brahms when they first became close in the 1860s. And there are many letters from that time that Levy's writing to friends, especially to Clara Schumann, where he evokes this kind of image of a really young, infatuated, starstruck almost, gay man who is, as Paul Sommerfeld once said, in the throes of his first infatuation, serious infatuation, because Brahms was 6 years older and much more confident at that point as a composer, just as a person. And so I have tried to do some kind of interpretation of Levy's potential reception of some of Brahms's songs from the time. Brahms's side of this is less clear. We know that Brahms seems to have fallen in love with various women over the course of his life. I'm not sure that he felt anything romantically toward Levy. He certainly enjoyed having a really talented conductor working for him, someone who had a really good sense of how the German texts should be set. So I think that Levy had to come to terms fairly soon in the course of their relationship, that Brahms did not want as emotionally enmeshed a relationship as he might have liked. So, yeah, I think if you read over the course of Levy's correspondence with Clara Schumann, that he becomes a little jaded into the 1870s. It's like she complains to him at some point, Brahms wrote me this letter and it was so cold and, And Levi says to her, that's how he is. Either he was not worthy of your friendship 10 years ago, or he's still worthy today. He tells Clara Schumann. So, within the decade of their friendship, he has learned how to step back a little bit. But yeah, I do think this is period in 1864, 65, when he's just completely infatuated. And you can see traces of it in the 1870s as well in some of the letters here today. Other questions?
Thank you so much. I told Paul, I just met Paul, I share a birthday with Brahms, and I just wanted to tell everybody that it's
Nice.
my favorite fun fact, and Tchaikovsky too, interestingly. I wanted to ask how this experience, less in terms of the friendships and how it impacted the friendships, but how did this opera that didn't come to be impact his compositions? So something you had said that I thought was interesting was, we know Brahms had an interest in folk music. Personally, I know more about Brahms and the hymns and his religious interests, and I see your book title. Maybe I'm reading something into your title that shouldn't be there, but just curious if maybe what Brahms might have turned his nose up to and thought was sophomoric. Did this kind of lead him into more serious music? Did it lead him into more folk music? Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a great question, because it's around this time that Brahms is starting to explore these kind of big public choral orchestral pieces. So 1871 is the Triumphlied, which is now not very well known, but it's a fairly well received piece that celebrated the victory of the Germans over the French in the Franco-Prussian War. And so he's writing these choral orchestral pieces that, to me, seem to be riding the wave of the success of the German Requiem. Like Rinaldo is another kind of tentative attempt into a more dramatic, quasi-operatic direction, and that's not very well received, so that also seems to influence him. He really won't commit to any opera subjects, though, consistently, even into the 1870s, even with people who aren't associated with Levi. So in this book, I try to figure out why. And it seems to me that there is a fundamental style of composition that Brahms has steeped himself in. It's very much in the choral tradition, Bach, counterpoint, and plenty of other early music models, all the way back to the 16th century, including folk music, but mostly in the contrapuntal tradition, that are somewhat at odds with what would make good operatic popular styles at this time, where you have beautiful melodies, right? Critics of Brahms's time consider that he doesn't have enough musical sensuality, even in music that's not opera. But opera is the one genre where you would want the most sensuality, right? And so there's this kind of ideological issue that he can't seem to get past. But he cannot write music that is sensual enough to be opera. And what is the most sensual of all the operas in this period? It's Tristan, right? And that's 1865. So right when he's starting to think, how can I write an opera? And he's trying to find an alternative that is not too Wagnerian, that might fit his own style of composition. So what is he looking at? He's looking at some Mozartian kind of comedies and stuff. He's saying to Levi, what if we wrote dry recitative? What if we just have dialogue and then like numbers, right? Like a musical almost, and he cannot figure out how to do it. So I don't know that any one rejection of a libretto put him in a direction, but I guess you could make the argument that the more he explores potential topics and the more he rejects them, the more he becomes entrenched in, I just can't do it, So, yeah. There's some kind of complex psychological thing going on here at this point.
Thank you.
Well, I was really amazed how well you illustrated how widely the whole Undine Melusine theme, this mysterious woman, is integrated in, I would say, Northern European culture. And it goes on until today. I mean, if you think, starting with Fontana, who did a lot with Melusine, and Hans Werner Henze with the lay music, and Ingeborg Bachmann, who wrote Undine geht, Undine is leaving, and I find it interesting that she has that juxtaposition, the male juxtaposition named Hans. Can you a little bit elaborate on that?
Melusina in the 20th century?
Or 21st?
No. That's beyond the scope of how far I've studied this topic. So if you know more about it, though, please share. I'm curious to know. I mean, as an American millennial, experience with Melusina is limited to, whatever Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale I know, and of course, the Disney version. So yeah, I haven't followed it in the world of art, music, and opera. Sorry. Other yeah.
Was that Ludwig Tieck who also translated Shakespeare in connection with Schlegel?
Yeah. Yeah, so they were all reading. Actually, Levi, where is he? There's my cartoon. Levi was a huge fan of Goethe, at the end of his life, published his own series of collected aphorisms and quotes from Goethe that just came out the year he died, 1900. So that was one of his kind of late life, just personal interest projects. So all throughout his letters are sprinkled these quotes from Goethe. It's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know that he was as into Tieck, actually, but he should have known the Tieck Melusina.
Other questions?
It's one in the back. I'm going to go back to our... If you all can just come to a consensus on what this first note is, I would love that, because I played an E flat, but I dithered about whether it's actually an F natural. Things to think about, audience. Yes, B.
I'm so sorry. I don't know anything about the relationship between Brahms and Wagner directly. Did they know each other, or was this all mediated through other people?
If you're interested, the Brahms scholar Styra Avens actually has all of their correspondence translated. You can see all 4 letters that they exchanged in English. And it was about the aforementioned Venusberg manuscripts that Brahms had. Some Lisztian pianist friend somehow had it and gifted it to Brahms. And so Brahms had it from the 1860s onward. And for whatever performance, Wagner needed it and demanded it back from Brahms. He was a little cagey about it. He was like, I don't know, this is an important thing. What are you going to give me in return? So yeah, they did not have much interaction at all. I know they met briefly in the early 1860s. There's a famous anecdote where Brahms played his Handel variations for Wagner, and Wagner said, "No, it's pretty good. You can see what can be done with the old forms when someone has a little talent." I think that was 1862. So Brahms had not become a big figure in the German musical world at that point, and so Wagner could be a little generous there, right? Wagner's rhetoric against Brahms I find fascinating, and it increases angrily in the 1860s in the wake of the success of the German Requiem. So Wagner has all kinds of lovely, snarky, angry things to say about Brahms, and Brahms equally has some side remarks. There has been a movement to paint Brahms as very generous toward Wagner, that Brahms did recognize Wagner's greatness in certain aspects and so on. But in terms of personal meeting, they try to stay apart. Yeah, so they kept to themselves in that sense. I don't think they ever even met after 1862.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McManus.
Great.
I think we're
Thank you.